Welcome to episode 350 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Mike Campi, who served in the FBI for 24 years. In this episode, he reviews his investigation of the Genovese crime family based on the cooperation of Michael "Cookie" Derso, a Mafia associate who decided to become a confidential source for the FBI after he was shot in the head and left for dead. Derso worked with Mike Campi, recording conversations with numerous powerful figures in the New York-based organized crime families, and captured evidence of extortions, murder conspiracies, money laundering, labor racketeering, and corrupt politicians. Derso helped Campi and the FBI convict more than 70 mobsters. Mike Campi's new true crime book, Mafia Takedown, the incredible true story of the FBI agent who devastated the New York mob, recounts how, for 3 years, Derso risked his life to assist Campi and the FBI in taking down the New York mob. Mike Campi served in the FBI for 24 years. He was initially assigned to the Cincinnati division. However, he spent most of his FBI career in the New York division, working both organized crime and white-collar crime cases. Campi retired from the FBI as the coordinator of the organized crime branch of the New York division, where he managed over 150 agents in the FBI's largest and most successful organized crime program. He was later recruited by a Swiss bank to be their vice president of corporate security for the Americas region. While listening to this episode, you will be as amazed as I was at Mike Campi's amazing ability to recall names, places, and dates. Now, before we get to the episode, I want to thank my former guest, Jim Weber, for inviting me to be a guest on his podcast, The Right to Remain Silent. You can check that out wherever you listen to podcasts. Please note that I will now be posting at least 3 episodes a month so I can catch up with my backlog sitting on the shelf. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com. You'll also find links to where you can buy me a cup of coffee, join my reader team all about crime fiction, where you can learn more about the FBI in books, TV, and movies, and also learn more about me and my books. Ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks available at Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Mike Campi. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Very good, Jerry. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, I am so excited because I got a copy of your book, Mafia Takedown, the incredible true story of the FBI agent who devastated the New York mob. Wow, what a title. That promises a lot.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's coordinated with the publisher.
And I already talked to you about the fact that they put down that it was written by Mike Campi, former FBI agent. And as an FBI agent, there's a distinction between whether you're former or retired. And for those of us who actually get to retire, it's like a badge of honor. So they kind of messed up right there on that book title.
True. You can cross it out.
You definitely are a retired agent. So the one thing about this book, I have to say, is there is a theme throughout. Over and over again, you hear the words betrayal, hypocrisy, and treachery. And as a matter of fact, I would love for you, if you have a copy of your book in front of you, to turn to page 5, scroll down, and can you read that 4th paragraph for us?
Amoral mobsters without honor are not the exception. They are the rule. Each generation of young men who seek to join in hopes of achieving honor and status and finding a new family to join are instead likely victims of the ongoing con. Despite what they may have heard, they are joining a glorified gang where there is virtually no honor and very little loyalty. Mob members will and have killed their best friends and family members without hesitation whenever it was in their interest to do so. They freely con and plot against one another, and they additionally spend their time conning, threatening, and hurting others, their victims, who are not part of the life. The single most disingenuous expression spoken by them is, "I love you." Never believe this statement. If you hear it, one of the driving forces for telling my story is to make this all clear.
Wow. And again, that theme goes through the entire book. And so I've read books and I've watched movies and TV shows where the mafia life is glamorized, but you make sure you are responsible in getting the message out that this life is nowhere near what anyone would call glamorous.
Absolutely. It's treacherous.
At the end of this case review, I would love to have you present your thoughts about how TV shows and movies and books about the mafia, why they make it look like, they're just these wonderful, strong, interesting people. So we'll say that for the very end.
Absolutely. Okay.
All right, great. I sent you an email after when I started reading your book because it's packed with fascinating stories about so many people that were in all the different families in the New York mob. Actually, you have a little bit of history where you're showing us about how the families came together and the different mafia bosses. And I asked you what we should concentrate on, and you told me that we should talk about your investigation and your success in getting one of those associates to cooperate with you. His name is Michael Derso.
That's correct. Yep.
All right, so where do you want to start? This is your show.
So, a prior investigation I had regarding the Genovese family and the administration of the Genovese family included an installation of a bug in a social club in Little Italy. And the social club was controlled by Jimmy Ida, who was the Genovese consigliere. And it was operated by a guy named Tommy Giggoli Sestaro, who was a Genovese soldier, old time soldier. This particular social club had members and associates from all five families frequenting the social club, especially on Monday nights when they had Monday night football and they had gambling. And so Derso was an individual that would frequent this social club with his cousin Tino Lombardi, Sammy Meatballs, and others. And so after taking that case down in a complex indictment, took multi-years to complete the investigation. Jimmy Ida is currently doing life in prison. I indicted and convicted the acting administration, which included Barney Belomo and a guy, Mickey Generoso. Barney was the acting boss, Mickey was the acting underboss, and Jimmy Ida was the official consigliere. Years later, I had information about a threat to Sammy Meatballs, Aparo. And I went out to Little Italy and did a little walk with Sammy about the information of a threat to his life. Basically told him somebody's looking to kill you. If you feel that the earth shake and you want to cooperate or reach out to me, this is my telephone number, business card. And I went back to the office. Later that day, Mike Derso was down in Little Italy. Derso was mentored by Sammy Meatballs and an individual, Joe Zito, who was a longtime Genovese soldier. And he could see Sammy was upset. And he said, what's going on? Sammy said that an FBI agent, Campi, was here earlier today. And initially, Derso thought, Campi, he's corrupt, he's with us. And Sammy said, no, Campi's the agent that put Barney, Jimmy Ida, Mickey Domino, and others in prison. He's as honest as the day is long. And he described the details of my conversation that there was a threat to his life. Derso at that time, I believe, associated the threat to the circumstances involving Frank Farby Serpico and Derso. That incident at that time, Frank Farby Serpico was the acting boss of the Genovese family, and he apparently wanted to kill Derso a few months earlier. Reason he wanted to kill Derso wasn't because Derso was wrong, it was really because Frank Farby Serpico was in the wrong. Derso had been betting at a gambling location that was apparently controlled by an individual named Castellano, and Castellano was with Frank Farby Serpico. The clerical person that took the bets, believe it or not, his name was Johnny Zero. You can't make this up. And Johnny Zero noticed that Derso's bettors, a few of them, habitually lost weekly. And instead of recording the bets, he would put it to the side one week. And apparently these bettors hit. They were owed about $28,000-$30,000. When Derso went to pick up the money for his bettors, Zero shared with him what he did, how he put the money aside. And Derso sort of laughed, thinking that was pretty shrewd, streetwise. And he said, I'll give you a week or so to come up with the money. What Zero did was repeated that process and did it again. Now he was in debt because they hit again $60,000.
So why did he do it again?
Because he's an idiot, because he's a zero. and so Derso tells him to get his boss on the phone now. It's Castellano. Derso, when he hears the name Castellano, he assumes Paul Castellano. This office is affiliated with the Gambino family. So he wants to facilitate a quicker payment process, and he proceeds to slap around Zero on the phone. Castellano tells him, don't hit him anymore. Come and get it. I'll give you a portion of the money. Castellano's located at some boat club in Queens. Derso goes over to get the money. As he's leaving, I think he got to like $10,000. He gets a call from an unknown male on his cell phone. And the unknown male tells him, don't you ever touch my guy. And in a threatening, disrespectful manner to Derso, as though Derso did something wrong, as opposed to Zero doing something wrong, he starts speaking down to him, telling Derso to have his old man, meaning Sammy Meatballs, meet with this guy at an Upper East Side restaurant in Manhattan to resolve this dispute. Derso hangs up after cursing at the guy, goes back to the office where Zero is, calls the unknown male up, and proceeds, I go into the book a little more detail, give Zero a beating over the phone. Totally disregarding what this guy said. Don't ever touch my guy. He leaves there after giving Zero a beating, demanding his money because he still owed about $50,000. I think Castellano only gave him 10, and subsequently gets a call from Sammy Meatballs to immediately come downtown to Little Italy. And what Sammy learned was Alan Longo, who was the acting street boss insulating Chin Gigante and the West Side crew, had immediately met with Sammy to say, Derso just insulted Frank Farby Serpico, who's our acting boss of the Genovese family. Longo was more of a street boss, running around doing the conversations with various crew members, resolving disputes, but Farby was the acting boss, and Farby wanted Derso killed. When they went through what Farby did, everybody realized that Farby was in the wrong, Zero was in the wrong, and Castellano that Derso wasn't in the wrong. But Farby, who was identified as the acting street boss, Sammy and others in the family had no idea that Farby was even the acting street boss, and he wanted Derso killed. That's what facilitated Derso deciding, after meeting with Sammy that day, if he was to cooperate, he wants to meet with Campi. And so as he was walking through Little Italy, which is near the courthouses in Manhattan, he ran into an old prosecutor who is now a defense attorney, and he discussed if she would be able to facilitate a meeting with an FBI agent named Campi. And that's where eventually we met. He cooperated. We thought we were just going to go 6 months addressing a group of individuals that were involved in bank robberies, multiple bank robberies, and that shot him, Derso, in the back of the head and killed his cousin at their social club in Brooklyn previously.
Yeah, why don't you go into that a little bit more? Because the Farby stuff is like the thing that made him make that call. But it really was this incident where he was shot in the head and his cousin was killed that had him thinking about cooperating.
So Derso, again, as I described, he frequented the social club with Jimmy Ida. And matter of fact, I subsequently learned from Derso that Derso, who made a lot of money as a loan shark and various schemes that he was involved in the street, he was a tough kid, bench over 400 pounds, didn't take from people, and had a bunch of incidents. Well, Derso was operating gambling club in Brooklyn. He had one of his loan shark victims was a guy named Carmine Polito. And Carmine Polito, also known as Carmine Pizza, also frequented the Jiggly Social Club. But I always saw Polito leaving with Ali Shades, who was a Genovese capo, and Ali Shades' crew on Monday night to frequent a restaurant in Little Italy before they returned to the gambling and Monday Night Football. And Polito, who was a customer loan shark victim because he was a degenerate gambler and owed Derso money and Tino Lombardi money, he wanted to be released from Derso and Tino Lombardi and be placed in the crew of Ali Shade's group. because of his role participating in bank robberies with them. And Derso didn't want to release him because he was such a good customer as far as a loan shark victim. And Polito wasn't a made guy, he was just an associate. And Joe Zito, who was extremely respected, he was an individual that was indicted in the Windows case and was acquitted at this infamous New York trial. They wouldn't release him. He was with Derso. And so what Polito did was, and it's more detailed in the book, he schemed to kill Derso and Tino Lombardi at their social club and flee with the impression that they weren't at the social club when the shooting occurred. And what happened was you had Polito with his cousins at the social club and others, and you had the kid named Bruno come into the social club. It's late at night. It's November 30th, 1994. And they provided Bruno with a gun. Bruno to shoot Derso. Well, Bruno put the gun right to the back of his head, so close that when the round left the gun, it ricocheted right down his neck rather than, if it was a few inches further away, it would have killed him. He went immediately to the floor. They thought he was dead, and then they shot and killed Tino Lombardi, and they fled. Derso came to and spent some time in the hospital. He wanted to retaliate. At that time, there were so many different people cooperating in New York. Not only not Al Diarco, the acting boss, the Lucchese family, Carmine Sessa, the Consigliere, the Colombo family, Sammy the Bull Gravano, and others, that they said he couldn't retaliate immediately because of all the cooperators. He'd have to kill 5 people. If one of them survived, there'd be additional headaches for the Genovese family. So that's the first time he couldn't retaliate. Derso managed to get on with his life, making good money. And a few years later, the incident regarding Farby happened in like 1998. And that's when he had enough. And that's when it facilitated a meeting with me. And we met in June of 98. And he agreed. I mean, there's a lot of more details in the book about that meeting. He cooperated, and our whole projected initial time frame was to go from June to December to address the various bank robberies that Polito and others were involved in, and the murder of Tino Lombardi and Derso's shooting.
Well, I have to say that being shot in the head has been the catalyst for a lot of mobsters, associates, or made people, whatever, cooperating with the FBI. I actually did an episode 209 with Elaine Smith, where she talks about a botched mob hit that encouraged Tokyo Joe to become a cooperator with her in the Chicago office. And I know in Philly there was another incident. I can't think of his name. I think his name was Michael. I can't think of the last name, where he was shot in the head, I think a couple of times, and he lived and became a cooperator. So, I mean, this is definitely a theme.
Absolutely. Think about that where Frank Costello was shot in the head. He didn't cooperate, but that was Chingiganti was involved in that shooting, and they went to trial, and Costello did not testify on behalf of the government, but that facilitated Vincent Chingiganti's acquittal in that trial.
Just sidebar for just a little bit. I mean, what is it that somebody has such loyalty that even when an attempted assassination is made, they still stick with this quote unquote family?
I think the tougher guys and the brighter guys cooperate in some capacity. Maybe not as a cooperating witness, maybe as an informant. There's so many recordings we made that capture the hypocrisy of the life. You know, sometimes the gangsters are saying this isn't what you believe it to be. This isn't what it used to be, where they think it used to be men of honor. In the book, I sort of point out, I think, the hypocrisy of the life going all the way back to the days of Joe Masseria, the boss, and Salvador Maranzano back in 1931. And I bring it forward to the present time where you have, so many violations of their rules in Omerta. And I do think that the made members avoid trials because of the recordings that point out the hypocrisy of the life in recordings and the treachery, where when you really think about it, your crime family is supposed to come before your blood family. The logic of that, where you're joining an organization that, say, on a small level, have in New York about 100 made guys, and on a larger scale with a bigger family, maybe 400 made guys, and each made guy has at least 10 associates. You're supposed to trust these criminals more than you trust your own family. If you have 4 or 5 good friends that you can trust with your life, really enjoy joining an organization where you're supposed to murder your brother or your best friend because you're committing to that when you become an inducted made member of an organized crime is just stupid on so many levels to me. And I've made so many recordings by gangsters that realize the hypocrisy of life, but they learn it after their own experiences witnessing it while living that life.
Yeah, that is absolutely, illogical for the rest of us to understand. I do want to read a sentence from your book on page 14. And you say the goal of this entire criminal structure, of course, is making money through crime. All of us in their worldview are suckers, ripe for the potential picking.
Yeah, it's true. I'll tell you a perfect example. One of the things that comes to mind, Billy Catullo, who was the acting underboss for the Colombo family, and Jackie DeRoss, who was a hierarchy figure. We're making recordings with Derso involving a dispute between two competing chicken businesses. And Derso's meeting with Billy Catullo, Sammy Aparo, Jackie DeRoss, a kid named Frank Campi. Campanella was his name. We laugh about that. No relation. But during the period of these recordings and resolving this dispute, Billy Catullo turns up missing. He was killed. And Jackie DeRoss, we captured in recordings. Jackie DeRoss was doing prison. He got life in prison also as a result of this murder, as did Holly Boy Persico, Carmine Persico's son. And the whole purpose that they killed Billy Catullo was because Carmine Persico was doing life in prison, was the boss of the Colombo family, wanted to ensure that little Alley Boy Persico became the official boss. And they feared that Billy Catullo, as an acting underboss and popular, wouldn't step down. So they killed him. And Jackie DeRoss was involved in that murder and is doing life. But Jackie DeRoss had Billy Catullo as his best man at his wedding. I can't imagine having my best friend being involved in his murder. As a result of Carmine Persico doing this, little Alley Boy Persico and Jackie DeRoss both got life in prison as a result of Billy Catullo's murder. And Jackie DeRoss showed up at Billy Catullo's wife's house after the murder and all that stuff. He disappeared, asking for money that the family gave to Billy Catullo. And the wife, in a very disrespectful manner, as I understood, said to Jackie, well, when he gets home, I'll tell him about it and have him contact you. She knew he was dead.
Wow.
But that's just cold to me, you know.
Oh, absolutely cold. And so now we can really understand why Michael Derso is coming to you, has finally had enough. So he's going to help you with these bank robberies. But it sounds like well, I know from the book that it really morphed into something much bigger than a 6 months cooperation deal.
Oh, absolutely. One of the first recordings we made with Sammy, our first recording, I believe, was about Farby's role as the acting boss and the pathetic request to have Derso killed. So we're already focused on a conspiracy to kill Derso and others from the acting boss and the details of the acting boss insulating Vincent Chingiganti as the official boss, who's in prison on the Windows case. It was a trial that was delayed for Gigante because of his pretending he was crazy for years. We get into that in the book at the end too.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that because the conversation from 9/11 that really kind of turned everybody's understanding of who he really was very interesting. But we'll do that at the end.
Yeah. So, as we're making recordings with Derso, you can see his capo was an individual named Ross Ganji. Ross Ganji became capo because Joe Zito turned down the position and deferred and said, look, because Joe was acquitted in the Windows case trial. And he felt that if he was a capo, law enforcement would be more focused on him in retaliation of him being acquitted for a crime that he committed. He recommended Ross Ganji be the capo. Ross Ganji's crew had a bunch of dysfunctional people that were easy to investigate, I would think, if you focused on them. And so he did not have the same respect from Barney Belomo as an Ali Shades Malangone. Ali Shades Malangone was a capo that oversaw the carting industry for the Genovese family, the garbage pickups, which was a big multi-million-dollar type of business for them in controlling who gets to pick up what garbage from where. And so I think Ali Shades Malangone had more credibility than Ross Ganji when it came to Barney Belomo as the acting boss, his decision making and support. So I do go into the book about how historically Sammy Meatballs Apparo's capo decades earlier had slapped Vincent Chin Gigante's father-in-law, and that probably put Sammy in a different light. He didn't think Chin particularly cared for him. So as far as the Derso control of Polito, with Ross Ganji being his individual supporting his position, they weren't going to release him, but it could have been that they authorized, with Barney Belomo and Ali Shades, Polito's shooting of Derso and Lombardi. And those are some of the recordings that we captured in that 3-year period where Sammy Aparo said they may have authorized the shooting, because the logic of what they were doing to Derso over the course of that period didn't make sense. Derso was somebody that was proposed for induction before we ever met. Those were recordings we had. But his induction was put on pause to go through a period of probation with Derso and Serpico. We actually made a recording hours after Vinny Aparo, Sammy's son, was inducted, where Vinny Aparo spoke about the induction ceremony, where they actually had to strip down naked for this induction ceremony. And Vinny Aparo on tape with Sammy and Derso explained that Hollywood does a much better version of these induction ceremonies than the actual ones. It was as though they didn't even remember the proper protocol for this induction. And Vinny and Sammy both said Derso should have been the one inducted, not Vinny. And they were saying to Derso that his induction is going to be the next one. But this occurred over, again, 3 years where they kept pushing it back.
And from the book, my understanding is because they thought he was a hothead, that he wasn't following protocol, even though you've told us that there really is no protocol. They do whatever they want to do.
Well, in some instances, so the China Club, which was a popular club in this Manhattan, it was affiliated with the Genovese family, and in particular with Barney Belomo. Derso and his cousins apparently had an incident there where they beat up the bouncer. So that could have been another issue that went against Derso in any kind of dispute involving the Polito murder. You had people going to bat for Derso to spare his life, that supported Derso in their conversations with Farby on why Derso should not be killed. And Farby relented and agreed. You had Ali Shades Malangone, you had Ross Ganji, you had Joe Zito. And Joe Zito was a historic figure who was respected by both the Uptown crew, the Bronx crew for the Genovese family, as well as Chin's crew. And that spared Derso. The items that Derso was involved in, it was almost like he was the capo in some instances when they would bring him to meetings to resolve disputes with other families and crews and ask his advice on how to address things. And in some instances, when we were recording them, he'd be the primary spokesperson saying, we're not doing that. And he's talking to, like I remember, Benji Castellazzo. He was talking to a Colombo capo saying that we don't agree. And I'll bring it back to, he referred to the fact that they'd bring it back to like Ernie Muscarella. Ernie Muscarella is somebody that's viewed, he's a power in the family, the Genovese family. He's a Bronx guy. I'm out of it, but I get calls from people in law enforcement today still, and some believe that Ernie may be running the family, and others believe that Belomo is running the family. So it is what it is. I do think that when I look at organized crime, it's not really a focus of the FBI right now in New York. I get a lot of calls from people on what would you look at? How would you investigate? It just seems that the FBI is focused on some other matters right now between terrorism and fraud and violent gangs, as opposed to La Cosa Nostra.
And what do you think about that? Do you think it's like a sleeping, monster that's going to rise up again because nobody's watching?
Well, I do think that there's a lack of expertise because things have evolved. It used to be wherein you'd have a squad investigating a specific organized crime family. So you'd have 5 different squads investigating specific organized crime families, and then you had organized crime squads in these Brooklyn, Queens RA and White Plains RA. But now you've only got 3 squads, and they've combined, I think one squad investigates the Genovese, Colombo, and Bonanno family, like the 3 together. And briefly, for me to simplify that, is when you look at how many unions the organized crime control, it's like 100 locals in the New York area, and putting it in comparison of a NFL football game. If your center gets injured and is taken off the field, you're not playing 10 against 11. You're going to replace him with somebody that may not be as good as the original center. Well, that to me is what happens with the unions. There's huge money to be made. So if we investigate and indict a union official, they're going to replace that individual just to generate additional money. And the labor racketeering type crimes, typically you'll get a plea as opposed to a trial. And in that plea, you'll try to reduce the sentence. They'll negotiate a reduced sentence to avoid the timeliness of a trial at court. So I do think if you don't look, you're not going to see how they're generating money. And you're not going to see how the populations of people that have passed away from an organized crime family have been replenished. And if you don't know, it's like going back to the 50s, starting over again. And I think that's a flawed decision. I do think when they investigate organized crime, that they should utilize the forfeiture to seize the money generated by the organization in a RICO type of indictment and conviction, and not concede too quickly in your plea agreements. Because some wise guys will take more time to keep more money, and others will pay more money for less time. But I just think you be as aggressive as you can. And there's so many attorneys. Like when I was thinking of this, there's so many agents who are lawyers. And I think, well, maybe civilly, why not let the FBI lawyers that may have a license to go into court and aggressively argue? Because again, once you get them convicted at trial, then you have the hearing for the forfeiture to the same jury. And if you're aggressive with seizing whatever assets were generated through these crimes, you'll get a bigger substantial portion of money that pays for the investigation and comes back to the government.
Plus, that's what this is all about, is making money. But if you threaten them being able to keep that or make use of it, then it really does hurt them where it counts.
Absolutely. And that's the type of behavior you want to correct, because they'll see you don't want to be involved in that capacity. You can be, if you want to be a criminal, go out on your own rather than join an organization. So say I'm one of a crew member that makes millions while another guy's a brokester that just is more of a killer. Well, when you do a RICO, the people that are in the enterprise, it's who has the money. If you're taking the money from the wealthy people that have that money, they're going to realize, why am I involved with a group when I could do this on my own? If you can do this on your own. But a brighter guy would also discourage his kids from getting involved in the life. Try to step away from it. And that's why I think raising children to discipline my kids, I would point out, if you do this, I'll do that, meaning you're going to get a timeout. And that lesson is learned by children. Well, I do believe that same type of lesson, doing what you say you're going to do, will be learned by gangsters, at least the brighter ones.
Now, during this time that you were working with Derso, I mean, you call him your stand-in FBI operative. There, there were a lot of murders going around. People were being killed and shot at all the time. Is that also a distinction of why they're not being looked at as much of a threat today, because there are not as many?
Yes, I do think that the murders, for the most part, have stepped away because it's life in prison in a federal system. And with all the cooperation, when you debrief cooperating witnesses, the details of murders come out, and those can provide significant jail times for those that just want to stand up for the family. They're going to prison for life. I think it's wise not to commit murders now, so you don't have the same level of murders you did in the past.
All right. So during this 3-year period that Durso is working with you, tell us about some of the significant things that he was able to make you aware of.
Well, every day was some schemes that were going on. It was amazing. There was a Jewish guy. This is a funny story. His name was Abe Weeder, and he owned multiple apartment buildings in Brooklyn. And he was previously ripped off by a member of the Colombo family to the tune of $400,000. He wanted to have local 32BJ, which are your cleaners, for the buildings. He wanted to remove the union. And the person that took the 400,000 did nothing. He just took the money. So there was a meeting where Durso went with Sammy Aparo, Sammy Meatballs, Vinny Aparo, and a Glenn McCarthy. Now, Glenn McCarthy his father was Jack McCarthy, an old time gangster with the Genovese family. And Glenn was a union guy. He was with Quiet Dom Cirillo, who was Chin's crew over there on the west side. And they coordinated a meeting with this Abe Weeder to facilitate the removal of the union. And they were going to replace the union with some bogus type of union that was created by an individual who was associated. He was the finance manager for a former New Jersey governor. We were making recordings where how they were going to save Abe Weeder $1 million a year, and that the savings in this money, the Genovese would get 25%. The group, Sammy Meatballs, Derso, and them, they would get 25% of the $1 million savings each year. And so it was fascinating. This was one of the things when we took the case down, you had all these gangsters, and Abe Weeder was an Orthodox Jewish guy from Brooklyn. So he had the long side, the robe, everything there. And Alan Longo, he looked at me with a group of everybody around and said, Campi, I think you made a mistake here. And this guy, Abe Weeder, was like a deer in headlights, had no idea where he was. And I jokingly said, don't you recognize your boss? That's Chin. And they all burst out laughing. Everybody laughed but Abe. Abe had no idea what was going on. It was hilarious. You also had Alan Longo's son, Danny Longo, where their scheme involved these high rise buildings, complex buildings in Manhattan, where they would force a blockage of the sewer system during like a weekend, a holiday weekend or whatever, as long as they were able to coordinate with a corrupt individual attached to the building, whether he was the supervisor or a building manager. And this building manager would be able to facilitate an immediate payment to unblock the sewer, and that they would be paid $900,000 for this unblocking the sewer that they blocked. And they were going to share in that proceeds, where Danny Longo would get $350,000 and Sammy and everybody else would get the remainder of the $900,000. And this was, unbelievable. As we continued to make recordings, we had a meeting with the mayor of Miami and an individual, Dominic Rebufo, in Florida. Dominic Rebufo was a former partner of Irwin Schiff. People in New York may be familiar. Back in 1987, Irwin Schiff was killed while sitting in a restaurant, infamous murder. And the individual involved in the murder, well, Bobby Manna, who was the consigliere of the Genovese family, and he was based in Jersey, was convicted in federal trial of this murder. He also got life in prison. But Rebufo was affiliated with the Genovese family. He testified at that trial, at Bobby Manna's trial, but he didn't testify. He testified more regarding corrupt bankers than he did about the specifics of the murder. Rebufo was in Florida, and he's now in prison doing, I think, 30 years in prison with his wife. But we met with Rebufo, who had a relationship with this corrupt mayor in Florida involved with the building of these hotels. And it was Derso, how we're going to facilitate this, how we're going to generate money. Derso was wired up, and we had an undercover agent. I wanted to use Jack, but Jack was involved with Jack Garcia, but he was involved in so many other narcotics transactions. It didn't happen. But this mayor of Miami, again, when we were doing Miami, I had Miami. There were some complexities there when you go from one division, New York, to Florida. I was making recordings regularly down in Florida with Derso because he lived in Florida, traveled back to New York, on a monthly basis or every other week to make recordings in New York. And we did a lot of recordings in Florida. Dominic Rebufo, there's a lot of details there in the book, but that was a huge money maker too. We had the tax doctor. Derso subsequently met with Patty Falsetti at a Christmas party in Florida, and it was Joe Zito that introduced him to Patty Falsetti, who's a power with the Genovese family, aligned with Barney Bellomo. And Patty Falsetti introduced him to Tommy Cafaro. Tommy Cafaro is Vincent Fish Cafaro's son. Vincent Fish Cafaro was an individual that cooperated with the FBI. He was a Genovese soldier that proposed Patty Falsetti and Barney Bellomo for induction in the Genovese family. So you can imagine the conversations we made with Tommy Cafaro and Patty Falsetti, who were very tight with Barney Bellomo, who I convicted, who was in prison. And we made numerous recordings of Barney Bellomo, historic crime with an ongoing crime with Patty Falsetti and Tommy Cafaro. One of the things involved an individual who was Barney Bellomo's accountant. They called this guy the tax doctor. Nobody's supposed to meet him. He's got Barney, and these are recordings we made. He's got Barney's millions of dollars offshore in offshore bank accounts. And so I created a scenario to provide and meet with the tax doctor to put money offshore. And we did this with Derso, where Tarangelo, his name was Peter Tarangelo, and he was originally from New York, living in Florida. And we created a meeting with Tarangelo to provide him with money that we described as being stolen from a major corporation out in Long Island, which didn't have the proper controls in place. And we had an associate that was stealing this money from this business for years and would love to put it offshore to conceal it. And we were going to do a test with the tax doctor, giving him $130,000. And our purpose was to record the conversations, but also locate where Barney's money was. So that occurred in the Bahamas, and I was sitting at a pool with a detective in the pool as Derso met with Tommy Cafaro and the tax doctor at the bar right adjacent to the pool. So it looked like I was photographing my friend in the pool, but what I was actually focused on was photographing the tax doctor and the transaction. And then I followed him to the bank, and we arrested him when we took down the case, and he cooperated. And that was the biggest concern, because this was, I think, just a few weeks before we took the case down. And apparently Tommy Cafaro went to visit Barney Belomo in prison. And when he came back, this was a few days before the arrest, Tommy said that Barney said, "Give the money back. Campi will find it." It was hilarious because Campi gave it to them.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that because, I mean, that's $130,000, which is really the government's money.
Yes. And the reason I thought that this transaction would be ideal was because it was going to be placed with apparently what we were learning was supposed to be tens of millions of dollars that were obtained by Barney in his criminal conduct involving unions and other things for years. And we thought it would be great from a forfeiture standpoint. But I had an ASAC at that time, who I describe in the book as Kingsley. That's not his true name. And he was more of an impediment to things I was trying to do. And I mean, we thought when you do forfeiture, huge amounts of money, there's a timeline involved in the indictment and the forfeiture for the indictment. And so I had Dan Gill, great forfeiture agent from the New York office, who was involved in this. And my ASAC did not want to fund this money because he just thought the risk factor of losing it. And we've made the recordings and everything. I just thought that he didn't particularly care for me, at the time. It was more personal than it was, a supportive role for management to ensure. I mean, it was a no-brainer to me because it was great evidence. It was money laundering, which are huge charges and jail sentences based on the amount of money. And he disingenuously said, "Mike, it's, if it was just a little less, it's the end of the budget year. We'd love to support you," but it didn't come across as genuine. And the fact that he said just a little less, when I left there, I went to the PD, we're a joint task force, and said, "Look," and I explained the money, how it's going to be placed with millions. We could do forfeiture. I said, "Why don't you fund half?" And the sergeant said immediately, "Absolutely." And I just walked him down to the ASAC with the PD. And I said, "I got great news, Kingsley. The PD's going to fund half so we can do it." He said, "If it was just a little less, we got it half only now." And you could see he was more angry than appreciative. And so we did the deal. We did the transaction. It was great. I had to take the case down eventually because they wanted Derso to kill this guy, George Barone, who was another historic figure. George Barone was a soldier in the Genovese family that went back to the days of Vito Genovese. He was with Vito Genovese back in 1957 when the Appalachian meeting occurred. And George was an individual that fought in numerous battles in World War II. He was in the Navy. He was at Iwo Jima. He killed a whole bunch of people for the Genovese family. He was to be killed by Derso because Patty Falsetti and Tommy Cafaro were coordinating this with Derso for the Genovese family. And the purpose was that Barone, before he went to prison, he was tight with Vincent Gigante, but Chin wasn't the boss. He was like a capo back in the day. And when George was going to prison based on his being found guilty of corruption with the ILA, the Longshoremen's Association, Chin asked George if he would facilitate a relationship with Chin's son, Andrew Gigante, and this individual named Umberto Guido. And Umberto Guido was an associate of the Genovese family involved in the container repair business for the shipping industry. The shipping industry, when it went from manually loading ships to containerization, George created New Local. And this is how the Genovese family facilitated control over the International Longshoremen's Association because of the number of made members in the Genovese family and associates that were in the local for New York, Manhattan, and New Jersey. which was huge. And that provided multi-millions in the Genovese family ability to earn money. So that said, Barone also provided Falsetti and Cafaro with jobs with the ILA. And yet all George was asking for when he got out of prison years later, Umberto Guido was a multi-millionaire, and he owed George like almost 60,000 from decades before. And they felt it would be insulting to Chin to have Bert Guido, who was now an associate under Andrew Gigante, who's not a made guy, to pay this money. When you think about it, the stupidity of it, Barone got Falsetti and Cafaro these jobs, no-show jobs, where they were making huge money. If that was me, I would have taken it out of my own pocket and paid George. Instead, they thought it was insulting to Chin by having Andrew Gigante have Bert Guido pay this money that was owed to George. So we were making recordings where they were going to use Derso to kill Barone. They gave Barone a partial payment in a parking lot in Florida. I was in the parking lot. Derso was wired up. It was so Derso can get a look at Barone as he was received 50% of the payment, and the other 50% was going to be made in New York, where they were going to summon him to New York, and that's where Derso was supposedly going to kill him.
And this is just so they won't have to pay him the $60,000 that they owe him.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And then again, this is what you were talking about, that this theme that we mentioned at the beginning, this betrayal, hypocrisy, and treachery.
There's a perfect example where the Blood family came before the crime family, because Andrew Gigante wasn't a made member of the Genovese family. He was an associate. Bert Guido wasn't a member of the Genovese family. And yet you're denying a payment to George Barone, who was not only a member of the Genovese family, but he made them millions. George subsequently cooperated. We hit it off. George. George would describe in part of his cooperation deal of how he'd fly out to negotiate shipping contracts with executives and then fly to Florida to kill a guy, a Genovese guy. In Miami. It's amazing the stories that George Barone had. He cited how he left the Chelsea area of Manhattan to join World War II to avoid being killed in Manhattan. And he was at Iwo Jima and other battles.
Wow. Better chance of staying alive in a war than it would be on the streets.
He did have a sense of humor. One more thing. I had to take it down not only because Barone was to be killed, but at that same time we were making recordings with Patty Falsetti. They were going to war, the 5 families in New York, against the Albanian gangsters, and that each New York-based organized crime family would provide 5 individuals to participate in these murders. So a total of 25 members of the 5 families would participate on a single day with fully automatic weapons to go into the clubs controlled by Albanian gangsters to kill them all. And Derso was going to be one. And that's where it was like, okay, they were going to give the Albanians a sense of being comfortable so that they could perform this murder. And that's when it was like, okay, it's time that we sort of coordinate everybody that's to be arrested and take this case down.
Yeah, in your book, you're saying that this massacre of the Albanian mobsters would entail maybe 50 to 100 people being killed?
Whoever was in this clubs, and that's where you don't know if somebody's visiting, girls are in the club or whatever, but it was just an out of control type of going to war back in the days of, say, the 30s. And I thought at that point, okay, let's get everything in order and take the case down now. It was going to be a few weeks to allow the Albanians to feel comfortable. I mean, some of the Albanians, what they did, and Jack Garcia made some recordings as an undercover about the Albanians, but some of these Albanians assaulted, say, Colombo Capo, threw him out of his own social club, beat him up and changed the locks, and operated from that social club. I mean, there was such disrespect from some of these crazy Albanians in New York that facilitated this conspiracy to murder them all.
Now, before we go to the takedown, I want to go back a little bit with Derso. I want to accent his cooperation. So let me ask you a few questions.
Sure.
All right. So during this 3 years that he's working for you, he's also worried about his own safety. And, you've mentioned a number of times where people might have ordered for him to be killed. And I thought one of the things that says a lot in your book is where he's actually warned by Sammy Meatball, who says to him, if I call you, don't come.
Yeah, Sammy was like a father to him. And that was one of the things that was upsetting to Derso, because like 2 weeks into his cooperation, he called me at about 1 a.m, where he was summoned to go to Vinny Apparo's house. And he suspected that they may have known he was cooperating, and he was already on the way and he wouldn't stop. And I was saying, let me get up there. No, I'm going to be there in like 10 or 15 minutes. And if you don't hear from me, you know what happened. So I remember literally as he was going in the house, he called me 10 minutes later because I was thinking just driving up. And he calls me. He is almost laughing. He goes, "You're not going to believe what they did." I go, "What?" He goes, "Vinny gave him a bag of guns with silencers because they anticipated there being a search warrant executed at Vinny's house because they received a document from somebody, a possible lawyer, that indicated there was an investigation of Sammy and Vinny Apparel. So Derso gave me those weapons.
They were just cleaning up their house?
Yeah, in anticipation of what they thought was going to be an executed search warrant. So that was, one of the indications where in a short time after that, we received another bag of weapons from Sammy that we had. And that's when Derso realized that, well, this is happening because he really thought of Sammy as a father figure. And as Derso was evolving and his reputation with the uptown Patty Falsetti and others was increasing, it was clear that he was going to be inducted and a powerful figure. Where Falsetti asked, would he want to come join the Bronx crew, leave Sammy? Sammy told him that. And Sammy said, yes, that would be in his best interest. I remember after taking the case down, traveling to prison just to let Sammy know how much Mike cared for him and didn't want to include Sammy, but there was no way not to include Sammy because of his role and my role in investigating the Genovese family. And Sammy totally understood it and told me to give his best to Sammy, that he has no hard feelings for him. He understood exactly why he cooperated.
There you go again with there was no honor,
Yeah.
Even if there was somebody they were close to, it was all about saving their own skin.
Yeah. And numerous recordings I made captured that out of the mouths of gangsters. I remember Patty Falsetti and Tommy Cafaro telling Derso, you don't want to be made. This life isn't what you think it is. And this is guys right around the top power of the Genovese family, discouraging Derso from wanting to be inducted, although they wanted to support his induction. Derso wanted to be made.
Now, I understand why Derso decided that he wanted to cooperate, but the circumstances are different than, what you hear about when people cooperate. Could you read the last paragraph on page 103 that kind of talks about that?
I should note that the circumstances of Derso initially coming forward are extraordinarily rare. He had not been arrested. He had not been convicted. He had not just been shot. He was not serving a lengthy sentence, which he hoped to reduce. And although he did have reason to be concerned about his welfare and safety, he had powerful allies in the mob, such as Joe Zito, who were working hard to ensure he stayed alive and well and eventually inducted. For all these reasons, the Genovese had no reason whatsoever to suspect Derso would flip either. Advantage, FBI.
And that really shows you why he was able to make all of these recordings. How many recordings altogether did he make?
We made a recording almost every day. I mean, I would have him when he was in Florida call up Sammy Meatballs on his phone to capture details of what's going on. When do I come back? And talk about what's going on in Florida and what's going on in New York. And every time he came up or I went to Florida, we'd make numerous recordings because they'd always be out to dinner. And every day was criminal conduct. Every conversation had conversations about crimes, ongoing crimes, details of participants. I want to say, I don't know, it seemed like 1,000. It was just a regular routine checking in, catching up on details, and identifying what are we doing next and what's going on. I remember Andrew Albin. Here's a knucklehead. He was an associate of Sammy Meatballs. We made recordings with Andrew Albin, who went to, I think it was Texas, and apparently got arrested in a drug deal that went bad where he was in a shootout. It was almost an attempted robbery. And the arrest was under a fictitious name that he had different identity. He comes back to New York and talks about what occurred. So now we're making recordings with him and about him and what he was arrested with. And when we got photos of the car, the shooting, I don't know how he survived and nobody was killed. But Andrew Albin went to trial. Derso testified. This is when I was left organized crime, his trial, and was in public corruption because of my issues with Kingsley. He was acquitted at trial. I was shocked. I was like, how did Andrew Altman get acquitted? Either there was some corruption on the jury, but they also described how Derso's testimony about Altman was what a moron the guy was. He was really somebody that had issues, psychological issues. And they thought because he wasn't a made member of the Genovese family, I didn't understand how he got acquitted. He ran out of the courtroom when the jury came back with an acquittal. And I'm sure he got arrested subsequently for other crimes because he just was unbelievably bad at what he was doing. There were so many different things that were going on. There was a check cashing. I told you this check cashing facility that was in Jersey City. We made recordings with Sammy and this individual who's an associate named Frankie the German Schwamborn. And Frankie the German Schwamborn was banging millions of dollars out in penny stock fraud type of transactions with Alan Longo and his son. And they were at this check cashing facility again. They were telling us nobody's to meet this guy. We created a scenario of providing them money to bang the check out. We were going to get the proceeds. And we created a scenario where the individual, his name was Robert Santoro, who operated a check cashing facility in Jersey City, met with Sammy Meatballs and Derso. We captured the meeting. I participated when the case came down on his arrest. It was hilarious because he lived in a beautiful, gigantic house down the Jersey Shore, and he had a toupee. And his wife apparently he said, my wife has never seen me without a toupee. And I was thinking, not that I have a lot of hair on my head. I said, well, she's going to see you without hair if she visits you in prison. He looked shocked. I was thinking we're going to get him to cooperate all because he had to remove his toupee. His wife, who apparently was an attractive woman, would finally see him. You know what? After he did prison, he did not cooperate. He went to trial and he tried to fabricate a document at the trial that would possibly get him acquitted. And we could tell it was one of the breaks on a Thursday afternoon when we got the document. We had that Friday and weekend to bring the document to one of these examiners that are qualified experts. He wasn't a government employee. He testified that Monday about how the document was prepared at different times. And you could see just by how the lines were lined up that the document was fraudulently created, that certain items on the document were created at a different time than the rest of the document, which showed that he fabricated this document. And the jury went from looking at the witness to looking at the defendant who was convicted. It was a comical moment for us because we were rushed to find an expert. And this expert, didn't know what the case was about. His whole expertise was describing the creation of the document and when certain items were they all created at the same time. And he said, absolutely not. You could tell that it was just self-serving to the defendant. And there was other evidence. I mean, there was a lot of things that happened in the 3 years, and there were numerous trials. But Derso did an amazing job. He was bright. I would be sitting like in Little Italy, perfect example. I'd call him on his cell phone and say, hey, come outside, because I could see the new gangsters that went into the restaurant to meet with Sammy Meatballs. I said, come out for a walk and talk with him. And I'd be photographing. I'd be sitting, like in some instances, I'd dress down like I was a tourist, shorts, sandals, baseball cap on backwards, where guys in my squad wouldn't even recognize where I was. I remember sitting next to a little Italian woman from Little Italy who asked me what I was doing. And I said, I'm an architectural student. This is a fascinating neighborhood. I'm taking photos for my professor. And what I would be doing was lining up the camera on a distance of a building from me to where I thought the distance of Derso, so I could then take a photo of them as I swung the camera over there. It was funny because Derso was about 60 feet away from me one time. I'm giving him instruction. He goes, where are you? Because he could tell that I can see what he's doing. There's hardly anybody around. And he's on the phone with Sammy next to him. And I would tell him, look at 10 o'clock. And he turned his head and then he'd look shocked. He would refer to laughing, like thinking nobody recognizes you sitting there. And I said, no. Do I look out of the ordinary? Do I look like it was just comical. He had a good sense of humor. Initially, when we worked together, I required him to tell me a joke a day for the first 2 weeks.
Did he have good jokes?
He did. He did.
Great. I know in your book that you say that Michael Derso's cooperation was historic in its scope and impact.
When Patty Falsetti was arrested, he didn't understand how long Derso was cooperating. He didn't believe Derso was cooperating. And I remember Tommy Krall, who was the arrest team leader on that arrest, when he told Patty just didn't say, just dismissed it. And when he got down to the office and realized everybody was arrested, he realized that, yes, he cooperated And at the same time, Patty just thought we made a mistake. And I think the reason he made that statement was because they were going to induct Derso. And I guess based on the induction, he viewed that we could have did so much more damage, but he didn't understand the indictment and how long Derso was making recordings at that time. And that's when I think after the fact, he realized what a hit. And I think Derso's cooperation facilitated so many others to cooperate after the fact, including Pete Peluso, who was Barney's attorney, Barney Balombo's attorney. And Peluso cooperated like a year or so later. And again, my squad did a great investigation, took Pete Peluso's others down. I think they realized it when faced with reality, the hypocrisy of the life.
Let's talk a little bit about the actual takedown, because when you're going to take down this case, the identity of your cooperator, Michael Derso, is now going to be out in the open. So for his safety, let's talk about what you did to make sure he was safe.
We operated him for 3 years. His parents had no idea what he was doing. His father-in-law was a retired NYPD police officer. They grew up in Vincent Chin Gigante's neighborhood. And I remember him asking me to meet with his father-in-law. And this is just a few days before the takedown. And I went. It was Brooklyn. It was at a restaurant. Derso's sitting there. I'm come in to meet with him and sit down. And that's when Derso said, told his father-in-law, I want you to meet a friend, Mike Campi. Mike, can you tell him how we met? And the father-in-law's look of shock and surprise. And, I described Mike got shot in the back of the head. They were looking to kill him after the fact and all that stuff. And father-in-law, it was like, if you want to come into the program with your daughter and your son-in-law, we'll sponsor it.
Did the father-in-law know that he was a mob associate?
Here's the thing. When Derso got shot, it was 8 months after his wedding. And Polito and others were at his wedding. So I would imagine the father-in-law, I don't know. I think he did. I would have thought, okay, how's he making money? Because he's living very well. What is he doing? He's owning apartment buildings. The area of Greenpoint is a very mob type of neighborhood. I mean, growing up in the neighborhood of Chin Gigante, I would think you can sort of connect the dots. But a day or two after that, I had to do the same thing with meeting Derso's parents, who were, spoke Italian. They spoke broken English. I met them at a hotel up by Central Park. They looked all happy until I described who I am and what Mike was doing over the course of the last 3 years. And they went with Mike when we took him off the street and placed him in this neutral area in Western New Jersey, a safe house, before he got into the witness protection program.
Well, there was a surprising part in the book where you talk about taking your own father to meet with them. I thought that was really interesting. First of all, your father speaks Italian. Do you speak Italian?
No, I barely speak English.
Well, tell us about what was going through your mind when you took your father, who's not associated with the FBI, who had no idea where he was going, to meet with Derso's family in the safe house.
Yeah. Well, my father would make unannounced visits over to my house in New Jersey, like when I was doing the construction and stuff like that. My mother would always call, "Where's your father? Is your father there?" Because he'd just unannounced show up at my house, my brother's house, or whatever. He loved seeing his grandkids. And I had learned years earlier and my father never shared details with me about this incident. When I was little, my father would always say things like, "What's a secret?" I don't know why he was telling me this because I'd roll my eyes going, "A secret is when you and as soon as I would say you and somebody knows, he goes, "No, when you know something, it's a secret. As soon as somebody else knows, it's no longer a secret." And I kept thinking, why are you sharing this wisdom with me like multiple times? So when I was in college, a friend of mine's sister was getting married. And one of the events was like at their house, wine, cheese, and a small population of people. And he invited us over. And I remember being in the kitchen when this Newark PD, Newark, New Jersey police officer, detective, I don't know what he was, came up to me, nice guy, and described how he was not the same individual who shot my uncle. And I just shook my head saying, "Oh, I know that. I know that." And I remember thinking, and the last name was Campisi, and I always heard the Campisi name at Sunday dinners at my grandparents' house, where my father and his sister or brother, his parents, would be discussing, this like Campisi family. Some spelled their name with an ESI at the end, some spelled it with an ISI.
Oh, well, wait a minute. What is this about your uncle being shot?
Well, that was the thing is I assumed my uncle, I'd bring my grandmother up to the Veterans Hospital where my uncle was. I thought he was injured in like war because he was in the military. I never had any idea, but apparently his injury was related to a Campisi shooting him, and it was all over a girl or something stupid. And I had no idea that that was the case. And when this individual came up to me in the kitchen and said, I wasn't the individual who shot your uncle, I just, said, I know. Oh, I know that, as though he was going to open up and tell me what it was about. And all he said was, that your uncle was a stubborn guy that didn't take from people. I just, in my mind, this is a secret my father was always keeping, never sharing it.
So your father never, ever told you.
Never, never. And to this day, I've got cousins that talk more about it, that probably know more about it and still won't share the details with me. But I figured since he's in the car, I got to go up there. Maybe once he sees, he's not going to know where we're going because he'd just get in the car thinking I'm going to the hardware store to get something. But when we showed up, they were interacting. They appreciated the fact that, his parents were conversing with my parents in Italian. And when we got into the car, again, it was a very rural area. We're leaving. And he, described them as very nice people. How do you know these people and all that stuff? And once he barely knew the streets in my town. He knew how to drive around to get to where he had to go to, but he wasn't somebody that was focused on streets. So I knew he had no idea. But he went on to describe, he said, what was that scar? Because when you look at Derso, he has a scar from the bullet running down his neck. It's probably 6 inches of a scar. And that's when I described the incident at a social club where he had friends that attended his wedding that shot him in the back of the head, thinking this would allow my father an opportunity to describe his brother's shooting. And it was a younger brother. And he just never shared it. To this day, my understanding, it's over some girl. And if you look up the Campisi family, there was a huge takedown. It's probably when I was in high school, and it involved numerous Campisis, about 17 murders, a bunch of murders, and it was a New York State organized crime takedown.
So you thought taking your father to the safe house and showing him Derso's family would allow him to feel finally that he could share the story of his brother shooting with you, but it didn't work.
It didn't. Nope, he went to his grave without sharing the details.
Mm.
I just think he just wanted to keep out of it. My mother's from Ireland. I don't know to this day what it was about, but I always wonder how many people that my father went to school in West Side, a bunch of neighbors went to school in Jersey. How many people in my neighborhood knew more details than I knew about it?
Very fascinating.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about meeting with Derso almost every day and all of these recordings, it's quite obvious to me that you're not the only one working on this case. So why don't we talk about, how cases like this on an organized crime squad are worked as far as case agents and administrative agents and all of this?
Well, in this case, I had Tommy Kroll, Craig Donlin. We had a detective, Bobby Vossler. We had a female agent attached. And that was predominantly, you have on RICO cases, organized crime cases, you're going to have sometimes multiple people attached. If you're up on wires, if you're conducting surveillance for the purpose of protecting a cooperating witness in these type of recordings. And so we had a team. Tommy Kroll was a newer agent. Craig Donlin worked with me on my prior case with Jimmy Ida, Barney Belomo. It's just a core group. Some are much more interested and attached to the investigation than others. I remember my old investigation. I had an agent. He was paid to breathe. He was supposed to be the person that sort of assisted in the facilitation of the forfeiture. He didn't do anything. I want to say I called him Eddie more or less. He had a different last name, which was more the opposite of more or less. And he just didn't do anything. I remember he didn't want to participate in arrests. I don't understand how you join a law enforcement group and not want to participate in arrests. And I remember he didn't even know where the U.S. Attorney's office was in the Southern District, which is just across the street from us. His desk was on the window overseeing the U.S. Attorney's office in the courthouses. Because when we took this arrest down, he had to transport his subject across the street, but it was a daisy chain. So Tommy Kroll, I remember when the case took down, he was a newer agent. He just loved the experience, and he eventually became a bomb tech because he didn't think that anything was going to compare to what he did in organized crime in an organized crime capacity. And he went on to other things. And I really appreciated the work that Tommy Kroll, Craig Donlin, at Glenn Munzer, you knew that they had a passion for the job. And they got along with Derso. Derso enjoyed working with them. And that was some of the most enjoyable time is working with agents in a brotherhood type of capacity.
Now, you've described all of these people working with you, and you just said a female agent. Now, I know in the book that you give her a name of Jane, and there is a shocking, shocking revelation at the very end of the book.
Yeah, I say Jane.
Do we want to talk about that now, or
I don't know how to address that because the reality is when Mike Derso told me it was years after I was out of the Bureau, but he had provided that to Jerry Capisi as it was happening.
who is Jerry Case?
Jerry Capisi has a website. He used to write for the New York Post and the Daily News about mobsters, and he then created a ganglandnews.com website. So every Thursday, he has articles, 3 articles, usually about organized crime. And Capisi knew about this back in, it was like 13 years before he ever shared it with me. Even before he shared it with Capisi, Derso provided it to this Kati Cornell Smith, who was a writer for the Post, court reporter, and she has all the notes on it and everything. And she had this information. And what he provided to them, if he gets killed, it's not the mob, it's this crazy agent, female agent. I was like shocked. I mean, when he was telling me what was going on, it then made sense to me because of other factors regarding his reputation. The reason I did the book was because Derso is a break guy. And initially, when we had the incident with Vinny Aparo picking up the guns, we purchased another device, recording device, so that when Derso was alone, if something like that happened again, he would be able to activate the recording device on his own. He knew how I do it with my preamble. This is Michael Campi, special agent with the FBI. Also present with me is Special Agent Tom Krall. Also present is Mike Derso, who's going to allow us to consensually record his conversation. Mike Derso, for voice exemplar purposes, please state your name and consent that you are allowing us to record. So that type of thing he was prepared to do in the event that a similar circumstance occurred. So I believe he recorded her. And I thought, I didn't want to do this book initially, but with all the gangsters out there with podcasts and all, I thought I cannot rely on me having to explain things to news or others because of what he's doing after the fact. Because he wanted his book, he wanted the story. I think he wants to be on podcasts. And I just assumed I have to tell the story factual way.
And has he been?
I think he wants to be on these podcasts. I don't know if he's on a podcast with people, but Johnny Alay has a podcast. I've seen Johnny post Mike's father passed away. Me and Craig Donlin were there, for the purpose of security so that they can have a functioning funeral. I think of My Blue Heaven, where you got all these different gangsters that have been relocated and all. So do I think he has recordings to this day? I still do. I do think he respects my position. I've explained it. I thought the fact that he wanted to portray himself as being officially inducted and made, that I don't like lying. That's not what I wanted to do. But in hindsight, when I look back, I'm thinking I have to go forward with the book. Plus, I had a 94-year-old mother who told the people in her senior center that her son's coming out with a book. And she keeps asking, when's the book? When's the book? So there were compelling reasons to just finish the stories.
My understanding, there's only one other chapter where information has been redacted. But when we get to chapter 18, where we talk about Jane and the shocking allegations that Michael Derso said about her and their relationship, there are lots of blacked out sentences in that chapter. So it is my understanding, although the chapter never says it outright, that there was some type of sexual relationship between Jane and your cooperator, allegedly, according to him.
According to him. And I escalated when he told me that to the FBI and subsequently to the Inspector General's office. So,
And what happened?
well, obviously they don't share the details with me, but I was told that she retired. So I'm not exactly sure what happened there. And I think it facilitated when I look at things like there was apparently a case with Joey Merlino from Philadelphia, who I think, and others, they had like very lenient plea agreements to such short sentences. I'm not sure if that's Joey Merlino, but others. So I have a feeling that, avoiding a trial because of that type of stuff probably facilitated weaker plea agreements on the evidence that was created earlier. I don't really know. Those are internal investigations. I do know if I did the internal investigation to corroborate it, how I would go about it, because I knew when I'm looking at the 302s, the timestamps on when we're making recordings, and yet he had specific details of where events occurred, when they occurred. Like he'd come off a golf course, which would have been hours after, because you play golf. A round of golf takes 4 hours. You're having lunch, take 5 or so hours. And he was describing details that would give me timestamp information, because there's all kinds of tunnels and bridges and easy pass that would maybe corroborate details he was providing that weren't consistent with where we made recordings earlier in the day in the city. I don't know what happened. I suspect, there was a period of time where she wasn't allowed into the office when I believe it was pay to stay home. It was such a headache. It's such a headache for me to think about. What he provided, I found to be credible and crazy. I just didn't understand it. I don't to this day, but I did find it to be total credible. And I do understand that he shared it with other people besides me. And I'm sure he shared it with his attorney.
And some of those people he shared at the time that he alleges this was happening.
Yes.
All right, so the takedown is done, and lots of mobsters are arrested. And because of Derso's cooperation, he opens the door to others that cooperated, which we've talked about today. And he goes into the witness protection program. But you do continue talking. And at some point, you guys get together and you decide that you're going to do a book and do a TV series or a movie together?
He had called and asked me if I would support a book because his 16-year-old son asked him, "Dad, were you a gangster?" So I initially thought everything's recorded. So yeah, I would support. It's all credible. It's all documented. I thought the purpose of the book was to discourage the son from the life, because I thought he had firsthand experience of the hypocrisy. At that time, I was working with a former prosecutor on a contract, and this was an individual that also prosecuted Vincent Chin Gigante on a matter regarding our 9/11, on both the original trial and subsequently we indicted Chin for obstruction when he was pretending he was crazy. So when I was discussing with the prosecutor how Derso called me and asked if I'd support a book, the prosecutor had a relationship with the publisher and said, absolutely, I could set up a meeting. And we set up a meeting, and that's when the three of us were sitting around discussing the book. And the publisher, it was supposed to be a brief half-hour interview. It was over 2.5 hours, about 2.5. And the publisher just loved the interaction between the three of us and cited how there's so many mob books out there. But if you had the former prosecutor and the FBI agent with the gangster, that would be an interesting, unique book. I didn't want to do it because the issue that Derso was having with Farby and his bosses that just seemed so ridiculous sort of paralleled in a humorous way the difficulty I was having with some of my supervisor and Kingsley. When I was trying to get things funded and do certain strategies, Derso realized what's taking so long, and he realized the complexity of my issues. I think the publisher found that to be humorous. So I said, let me discuss it with my family and get back to you. I didn't want to do it. My family, though, wanted me to do it. They're fascinated. Everybody keeps saying, you should write a book. You should write a book. Why not just go forward with it? So then I didn't want to disappoint them and or Derso and the prosecutor, and said yes. So subsequently, like a few months into this project where we're writing our stories, we're meeting with people that are affiliated with Hollywood on whether to do a TV series or a movie. And they were talking about so many stories we had that it would be more likely a success as a multi-year TV series with 10 episodes a season. And there's a lot of comical stuff. We were meeting with somebody that was going to promote this. We're sitting on an Upper East Side restaurant on the sidewalk outside, sunny. And who comes by but a Colombo capo who me and Derso immediately locked eyes. It was one of the people that we made recordings where they were looking to kill him in the Colombo War, Persico. We both believed that he had seen us, but ignored. And I watched him like a hawk as he walked to the corner and made a right. We laughed about it. And then they were saying, what are you guys looking at? We just just waited till he was gone to saying there was a Colombo Capo that was part of our recordings that they were talking about killing. Jackie DeRoss was talking about killing. And that's when the meeting sort of, I think, didn't end abruptly, but shortly after. But that was one of the factors. Then when Derso wanted me to lie,
What did he want you to lie about? Something in the book?
yeah, I thought it was talking about Hollywood. And I said, look, Hollywood is creative. And that's when he said, no, I'm talking about the book. He wanted to be portrayed as inducted, made member. But we made so many recordings that clearly he was to be inducted. Either inducted or killed, but he was to be inducted, and he was treated in such a respectful manner as a made guy, meeting with capos of other families to resolve disputes. He did like a street move. I'm not going to do it unless we do it this way. And I was thinking, well, I didn't want to do it. That's when I was ending the relationship, saying, we're done. Don't even call me or text me anymore. It took a while, like a year, I think, before I accepted a text. And it was more me trying to get him back into like a more faithful position and to be honest as opposed to be deceptive. So in that regard, I stepped away. The prosecutor told the publisher we weren't going forward. Why? And then the publisher said, look, your stories can still go forward without him. I didn't want to disappoint the prosecutor, so I continued. Then the prosecutor, like a year ago, when the book was almost done, it was about to be printed, he's going through a difficult situation and decided he was stepping away. I don't want to get into the details because he really didn't provide those details, and it's personal probably. But at that point, the publisher asked me if I could remove his stories, and I supplemented additional stories for the book, including the George Barone details, and went forward with the book to complete it. It's been a process. Happy that it's done. I'm getting good feedback from people that have read it and enjoy it. A lot of friends that I worked with in that life are like, how do you remember all these names? I do provide a list of names and positions in organized crime for the readers.
I was wondering the same thing because it's like a history lesson as you go through instances and names and everything.
It is funny. One of the things that I really enjoyed in my career was testifying rather than for the prosecutor when the defense tries to cross examine me and they ask a question that they clearly don't know the answer to. And I remember at a detention hearing, huge group of gangsters, including Power from Quiet Dom, guys in Chin's crew. And it was being conducted in an immigration court, big courtroom. And I remember this defense attorney asking questions, and my answers where Quiet Dom put his hand on his defense attorney's forearm, indicating stop asking him questions. And they all got detained and pled guilty. But those were the moments that I enjoyed the most, was the cross-examination.
So we've had all of these convictions. I do want to ask you one last thing, and that is about forfeiture, because we still have this $160,000 of government money off in some offshore account in the Bahamas. So were you able to get that money and all of the, what you hoped were millions of dollars back?
There were multiple trials, but that aspect of the forfeiture, because of the issue with Kingsley was
And again, Kingsley in the book, it's a fictitious name, is your ASAC.
is my ASAC. There was a position opening up as the supervisor of an organized crime squad. And I would have guys on organized crime come to me rather than check the computer asking me, do you know this guy? What can you tell me about this guy? And I put in for a position. And you know how they rank the people for the supervisory desk? My understanding is they'll rank who put in for this position, say in New York, and they'll send it down to headquarters. Well, Kingsley, in front of a group of other on the panels, when somebody said that Campi should get the desk, he said, Campi will never get a desk in organized crime as long as I'm an ASAC. And that's when my wife and family wanted me to leave organized crime and go to white collar crime. And that's when I left. So I couldn't be at a lot of these trials. So the forfeiture wasn't what it should have been. You could do it today because it's still probably money laundering where they're putting the money in offshore. So I don't think that we recovered a substantial amount of forfeiture as we should have. In the IDA case, my prior IDA case, we got $5 million in forfeiture. And it's just a process of focusing and projecting with the prosecutor for forfeiture how to go about and why to seize this money. I don't know that the Eastern District had a forfeiture prosecutor on any of it. There was, I think, 8 trials, but I don't think they had a forfeiture prosecutor on it. So to this day, I don't know how much money was forfeited in obtaining the plea agreements. I would hope significant in the millions, but definitely that was an aspect that wasn't addressed as efficiently as it should have been due to Kingsley's role.
And you having transferred off the squad at the time.
Yeah, I was supervising a public corruption squad.
This has been a fascinating case review. We've learned so much about organized crime. And before I ask you my standard questions and wrap this up, I do want to talk to you about your thoughts on why the mob is so glamorized on TV shows and books. And it's something a little different than, I assumed it was the writers who were glamorizing their role and their status, but you brought an interesting thought to why they have such a reputation, even though, as you said, they're really just a gang.
I mean, when you go way back to the beginning, it's the unions and the mob's control and treachery back in the day. You go back to Al Capone. They were doing a movie about Al Capone. You had Willie Beoff. I put this in the book. He was an infamous gangster who was close with Capone and Frank Nitti. He ended up cooperating, and he described how they gained control over the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. They'd bomb the cars, they would cause issues with filming and threats, and that's way back in the day.
I wanted to just to talk about their infiltration into the film industry.
So going forward, when they did The Godfather, where they were so impressed with each other that Hollywood enjoyed presenting that depiction of them in this honorable manner. So when I look at how they do things, it becomes cost efficient. So actors are actors. If the unions want them to pick movies in such a manner, and there is associations from Hollywood with organized crime. So James Caan historically had a relationship with Andrew Russo with the Colombo family. I mean, talking about current, you had, I cite in the book, attending the Bronx Tale, the party for the release of the movie The Bronx Tale with Robert De Niro. Robert De Niro grew up in an area, and there's these relationships, I believe, with organized crime members that facilitate this depiction in an honorable manner. But the reality is, the recordings cited show the hypocrisy of that life, the treachery, how they don't trust each other, how they screw each other for modest amounts of money, and how they're envious of each other. And I think the people that are in a position of most risk are your bigger, muscular guys, because they may have a sense of humor and say something to somebody like a Sammy the Bull, who's like 5'4" or something like that, little guy, and he finds it offensive, and he may laugh at it, but he may hate your guts. And
Oh, I remember that Joe Pesci scene
yeah,
where somebody says he's funny. So basically,
ha
what
ha. Yeah.
yeah, so basically what we're saying is that a lot of the reasons for these unreal, generous, and falsified portrayals is because of the mob's infiltration into Hollywood.
Yes. And, it's all about money. If they're going to cause my filming financial issues and obstacles to succeed, it's like, let me go along to get along. And that's Hollywood.
All right, so the end result, and I'm reading this from your book, the end result are films that gangsters everywhere fall in love with, and it's all falsely portrayed them as glamorous men and honor because the producers and the film and theatrical unions don't want to get into any trouble with the mob.
I'll tell you a funny story. I was asked if I would, I guess the last season of The Sopranos, and I didn't watch The Sopranos, if I could speak for an article, I think it was Forbes magazine, about The Sopranos, my thoughts on The Sopranos. And I said, well, give me a season for I can watch because I don't watch Sopranos. The media guy, Jim Margolin, laughed about it, and they gave me the first season. Well, I would go to bed and stick it in, and I'd be on my side trying to go to sleep. But my wife, who never wanted to hear about organized crime when I worked, would like watching them. But I noticed a lot of the stories were based on some factual details, just the names changed. I made recordings with Patty Falsetti. One of the actresses, I believe, was related to Patty Falsetti. And so there is some history, when they facilitate work also for guys in life. In the book, I cite about the Harvard Man. Sammy Meatball's grandson, Michael Aparo, was in the Harvard Man. Comical thing about Ali Shades at an Upper East Side restaurant describing to Hugh Grant and Elizabeth Hurley his role as a capo on the Genovese family for their movie Mickey Blue Eyes. So Hugh Grant that was a comedy where Hugh Grant, it was a sort of an organized crime type of comical movie. But Ali Shades, Alan Longo, we recorded talking about how Ali Shades was violating omerta by specifically identifying not only his role as a member of the Genovese family as a capo, but everybody in his crew and associates, and all because, he was infatuated with Elizabeth Hurley. They invited him to his bar restaurant in Brooklyn. Johnny Green Urso, who was a Bonanno capo, obtained the limousine rights. I think it was for Mickey Blue Eyes. It may have been for the Harvard Man, but this is all on recordings. And it's just fascinating, the connections between people and the life.
The portrayals that we see are facilitated not only by their control, maybe of the unions, or the producers' fear of retaliation if they don't tell a more glamorous story, but also because they've got relatives that want to act in those particular movies and films and be a part of the movie life. That's all fascinating.
The actors of Hollywood, they may not understand the life except for how it's portrayed to them by gangsters. There are some bright guys in organized crime, but there are some morons. And I think there are a lot of morons.
So we've come to the point of the episode where I like to learn a little bit more about you. Why and when did you become an FBI agent?
When I was in high school, math was my strongest subject, and my guidance counselor told me that I should pursue in college a degree in accounting. I took about 3 years of accounting and realized I didn't particularly care for accounting, and I could not see doing this for a career. And I had buddies that knew that went to high school with me and were in college with me in the School of Business. They could not wait to show me an article. It was either in Time or Newsweek of college graduates 5 years after graduating working in the capacity of what they studied in school. And accountants were number one who were no longer working in accounting. So I dropped accounting. And about a year later, in the summer, my mother called me when I got home from work to go to this 4th of July barbecue. I wanted to go out. I met an FBI agent, and the FBI agent talked about being an FBI agent. And what they were looking for were accountants and lawyers. So I went back to school to pick up my accounting degree because I did want to do something that made a difference. I almost joined the military, but I didn't because I played rugby and wrestled in college. So I sort of enjoyed that. But that said, I applied for a position with the FBI and I got hired in a support capacity. Eventually made my way to a white collar crime squad as an accounting technician was the term back then. And there weren't hiring because of the financial situation going on back in the day. Eventually, when the opened up, we were involved in narcotics investigation, the FBI. They were running every 2 weeks a new agents class, and I got assigned in 1983. I thoroughly enjoyed the decision I made and find it to be a divine intervention.
From your book, I learned that you were initially assigned to Cincinnati, Ohio, and then you were transferred into New York. And you spent most of your career working organized crime. And then towards the end of your career, you went back to public corruption.
Well, I did public corruption and then got recruited back to be the organized crime coordinator when Kingsley left. I was used as an expert witness in organized crime at hearings and trials at that time, and then eventually got recruited into private industry, obtaining a job with an international bank.
And what are you doing now?
Occasionally I do contract work, but I pretty much enjoy being a grandfather, assisting my daughter with three granddaughters, newborns, twin girls, and her 130-pound Rottweiler. The last time I did something, it was an individual, that multimillionaire that apparently thought his relatives were stealing from him that worked in his business. So I reviewed records, documents to present to a prosecutor. We saw some criminal conduct and civil conduct.
So his relatives were stealing from him.
This individual had complexities. He had suffered from Lyme disease. So initially, yeah, there was some type of theft that seemed to be going on. But as a result, I didn't realize that he was suffering from Lyme disease. One of the things that he was identifying that he cited they weren't authorized to do, I found documents with his signing off allowing them. He just had no recollection of it. And he had such horrible business records. And there was a bunch of different people. Like he had a clerical person that was making almost 200 and something thousand, 300,000. She was in charge of payroll. It was bizarre. And they stopped working on this project because he had twin girls, young girls. And I kept thinking, if he's paying us this substantial amount of money, how's he going to take care of his family? So we did wrap things up years ago. Occasionally I do some work reviewing fraud, like ADP. I worked for them where it was involving review of possible fraud documents. So I do contract work. I do sometimes security if I get a call, but it all depends on what I'm doing related to family and priorities now. And I wanted to finish the book. So that was a focus the last year or two.
Well, the book is done. And before I ask you for your last words of wisdom, I just want to talk about the book one more time. It is called Mafia, Takedown, the incredible true story of the FBI agent who devastated the New York mob. And it's available wherever books are sold.
Yep, I see it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and there are bookstores. My understanding is it's a quick delivery. So I appreciate it, the interview, the opportunity to discuss the book.
I like to give my guests the last word. So, what would you like to say?
I enjoyed my career as an FBI agent. In the book, I cite my favorite movie I watch every year is It's a Wonderful Life, and it's the impact we have on others. And we never know the extreme details, but I know taking murderers and evil people off the street, that has a positive impact on others, future victims, prior victims, and possibly changing the lives of the gangsters' children to just live a normal life as opposed to a criminal one. So I enjoyed that part of it. I bumped heads with management on occasion because I have that stubborn gene. I don't know if it's Italian or Irish or just me. But I thank you, Jerry, for the opportunity with this interview. The one thing I look at is if you join a law enforcement agency, don't listen to what the media is saying. But if you're working in a law enforcement capacity, you joined it because of the unique experience. So just grind it out. Do the work. You joined, I believe, law enforcement because of the unique experience, the unique opportunity. So do a good day's work and you'll look back on it, the experiences, and appreciate the unique opportunity you were afforded. And stay safe.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a direct link to the show notes where you'll find photos of Mike Campi, along with case-related news articles and images. And of course, there's a link to where you can purchase his book, Mafia Takedown, the incredible true story of the FBI agent who devastated the New York mob. There's also links to previous episodes of FBI Retired Case File Review focused on the mafia and organized crime, including another case review where a mob associate cooperated with the FBI after being shot in the head and left for dead. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.